NMBA webinar of 2015 on pensions freedoms. We're delighted to be joined today by Martin Lyons of Partnership, a well-known presenter on the circuit already that I'm sure quite a few of you may be familiar with already. Today's session is due to last approximately 45 minutes with some time at the end for questions. You may notice a question panel on your screens with the facility to type in questions at any point that we will deal with before we close off today's session. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Without further ado, over to Martin for today's session. Thank you, Martin.
Great, thank you. Grand, thanks very much. Let's see if we can get the presentation up. Hopefully you can all see my natty title there of New Pots Rolled. Of course, we're only a week or so away from the pension freedoms that Lee's mentioned there. So all good news. We obviously need to be in a position ready to go in this new advice environment. I'd obviously been to a panto when I came out with that title, so apologies for that. Obviously a lot's been going on recently, even within the last couple of weeks on some of these changes. I think it was Groucho Marx who said, you know, I've got plenty of money for my retirement as long as I die before 3 o'clock this afternoon. And clearly we don't want to be in that position. How people treat these pots of money within their pension scheme, how they designate income is obviously going to be vitally important from a tax point of view and from the point of view of making that money last. And advice, as we know, is going to be absolutely fundamental to making sure those decisions are right and that clients get the good outcomes that they deserve in this new environment. Got a number of learning objectives that you've hopefully already seen. These are they. It's going to be a bit of an Andre Previn style because I'm going to make those points, but not necessarily in that order. So hopefully by the end of the session, we'll have covered those learning objectives, or at least there'll be areas where you can identify some more information is needed, and you know, and we can take things from there. But it is good news. Within the next couple of weeks, we will have a situation where people have got this freedom and choice, able to access their pension fund in a number of different ways, and it does create more choice for individuals. As long as they get the right information, they should be able to make informed decisions. But of course, as we know, and I guess the purpose for going through a case study today is just to illustrate that, you know, responsibility for retirement isn't necessarily the same as knowledge. Knowledge around, you know, taxation, longevity, the products that might be available, the investment funds that might be appropriate, and so forth. The way to structure the income in a sensible way. When we put this slide together, we're using those 3 arrows. We didn't really have any idea that we were going to see those 3 arrows again in the logo for PensionsWise. So guaranteed guidance is going to be available, as we know. I think the phone number's out there somewhere, and individuals will be able to make those calls into TPAS, go and see their local citizens as advice, and probably get referred to another office to have the appointment, but nevertheless will have access to this guidance. I suppose it's good news for those, you know, 60% of people who, you know, basically were doing nothing when it came to open market options and so forth. But as we know, you know, guidance is very much information only. When it comes to implementation and advice, clearly that's the remit of the regulated investment advisor. So we have got some way to go. I mean, given that we're only a week or so away, there are some challenges in the marketplace for those individuals that aren't seeking advice, and just illustrates the need for what you do as advisors. Because whilst we're talking about lump sums today, and in the case study specifically about a protected lump sum, it's interesting to note how people think about lump sums. This was a survey that the ILC did in January, and they asked people of various ages, what's the best way of extinguishing monies from your pension pot? What's the most tax efficient way to make withdrawals? And just to illustrate we've got some way to go, about 20% of individuals knew what marginal rate of tax was. Most people didn't have a clear understanding of that. And so perhaps it's no surprise when they ask this question, what's the best way of withdrawing your pension fund, and give them the option, only about half of the individuals thought the best idea was to withdraw cash, withdraw income over a number of years. Now, that might be, you know, a situation where drawing out in another way might be appropriate because of personal allowances and so forth, but in general terms, we know that's probably not the best way to go about things, particularly taking into account this thing called month one taxation that we're going to have once these flexibilities are in place. A lot of people thought that maybe one big lump sum might be the idea. About 10% of individuals thought taking money out as one lump sum would be most appropriate. And again, it might be for some, depending on where they are in terms of personal allowances and so on and so forth, if it's a small amount. But a lot of people just simply don't know about the best way to withdraw their DC pension arrangement. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that a number of you will be on some sessions that we're doing around the country with various groups over the next couple of months. So I haven't built in the month-one tax calculation, but what I would say for the purposes of this webinar is that if you haven't read the HMRC newsletter 66 and HMRC newsletter 67, it's probably a very good idea to do so. Newsletter 66 will confirm that under triviality and small pots, which still exist incidentally post-April, contrary to popular belief, under those bases, a 20% tax rate is assumed on the taxable element. HMRC newsletter 67 confirms that if individuals are taking an ad hoc lump sum, aside from those scenarios, and they haven't established a regular pattern of income, that lump sum, bearing in mind most of it will actually be cash, most of it will be income, will be taxed on a month-one basis. So the whole of the pension's income element of that being taxed against a 12th of the personal allowance and a 12th of all the bands. For a lot of people, putting them into 45%, even though they're not a 45% taxpayer ordinarily. And there's a form P53 should those individuals wish to claim that tax back partway through the year. So it's a real key point that people need to be made aware of when they're looking at, do I take these payments in one chunk or do I spread them over a number of years? Really important element. So we've got some way to go in terms of people understanding how the taxation is going to work. Folk have got some idea of their objectives. We know that people don't want an annuity. They've heard that's a very nasty thing over the last 12 months. But actually, according to Nest, when you look at the objectives people have, many of them still want a guaranteed income for life. 16% in that second line there. But if you read down, there's another element of that population who wants some of it converted into a regular retirement income guaranteed, that's 19%, and then again the line under that another 13% basically saying you want part of it guaranteed, about 50% in all in that particular example, and our own survey showed it was about 64. So whilst people are a bit worried about the term annuity, they know they want a guarantee in some way, but they want guarantees and flexibility, no surprises there. In fact, the ILC then went on to ask people, well, what do you understand by these terms? So we've read about the different retirement options that are becoming available. We've read about flexible payments from pensions, using your pension as a bank account, and so on and so forth. What does the population understand by the terminology that's actually used? And only about half of people understood what an annuity was. Many people not understanding what drawdown is and so forth. So there is a challenge, and obviously that's good news for advisors, because I think when people, if they go through the guaranteed guidance situation, will realise that actually the scenarios are far more complex than they perhaps initially perceived. According to the FCA, this is their occasional paper 5. There were 4 or 5 different papers that the FCA produced in December, all around freedom and choice, the different retirement strategies that might be in place, some of the risks associated with that. And what they did note was that because of the press coverage of the annuity market, they were concerned that the use of the term annuity reduces the number of consumers who choose an annuity, even though consumers appear to value the underlying characteristics of an annuity. So there is some concern around that, and if you want to look into those papers again, it's probably worth doing so. Certainly happy to send you links to all of those, just to see what their analysis actually showed when they did the research. But before we go into the case study, it is worth noting that annuities do need to change, and they will be doing so. Here are just some of the, here are the changes that are coming in from April, which still allow annuities to be called lifetime annuities, but allow a bit more flexibility. So let's just run through these very briefly, because today's session isn't specifically all about annuities, but I just wanted to share these points if you haven't already got them. The annual rate of income under annuity will be allowed to go down as well as up. So you can imagine a scenario where somebody may have a level of state benefits that's due in the next few years, for example. They want to set their annuity up, but actually want to take account of that later income coming through and adjust their incomes accordingly. If that is established up front in terms of how that might work, then the individual can have that, and it can still come under a lifetime annuity basis. You might also have the situation where you just may have people who recognise that actually they have a more active retirement in the early stages. Maybe they're more passive, and then perhaps we have a dependent stage later on, and that income can be adjusted, as I say, but it needs to be set up at outset. The other thing worth noting is that where an annuity is in play post-April, taking an income from an annuity doesn't in and of itself trigger the money purchase annual allowance. If it is an annuity as we sort of know and love it today, I use those terms loosely, of course, but if you are looking at some of these flexibilities, i.e. that decreasing amount, then you are down to the £10,000 money purchase annual allowance. Again, that's not in scope for this webinar today, but we will be picking up with a number of you at events over the coming weeks. Allowing lump sum to be taken, well, again, we've just got to make sure we understand the terminology when the term lump sum is used, because what they're talking about here is increasing the income payments later on if that's what the individual wants. So again, you could mirror this U shape of retirement, for example, by increasing payments later. No limit on the maximum guarantee period that can be offered. So there are certain countries, in Chile is the typical example, where longer guarantee periods, 15 to 20 years, are fairly commonplace, and people like the assurance, the guarantee of that income coming over a longer period of time. Particularly now you've got more flexibility over who can receive benefits under guarantee periods and so on, then that might be a good option to look at. Clearly, with an office like ours, who have expertise on mortality, if you set your guarantee period out for longer than the life expectancy, clearly that's going to have a big impact on the rate of income. So maybe there are limits to whether that's viable from a cost perspective, but again, it might be valuable for a number of people. Tied in with guarantee periods is the commutation of guarantee payments on death on a triviality type basis, i.e. or the triviality limit of £30,000 for death benefits. So if you have a situation where, let's say you have a 20-year guarantee period and it's £1,000 a year and the member dies after the 5th year, do you want £15,000 as a recipient trickled in over the next 15 years, or would it be better to have maybe a slightly smaller amount, 13, 14,000, whatever the figure might be, because there's a commutation factor, but is it better to have that up front? And those are the choices that individuals will be able to make. Now, of course, I did say that one of the learning objectives was to look at the death benefits, the changes to death benefits, so we can't really bypass this particular section without talking about the autumn statement. And of course, the autumn statement was the one where there was lots of news about, nails in the coffins for annuities, all that kind of lovely thing that we sometimes get when we have those news feeds in the office. And it was all about, of course, the removal of the 55% tax charge for lump sum payments out of drawdown if the member passed away. Later on, of course, they announced that it was 45% if the person died after age 75, and then sometime after that it was announced that it also applies to annuities in terms of value protection. So let's just recap on how this works, because there have been a few sort of misunderstandings around the taxation of death benefits recently, within the last few weeks, particularly when it comes to the inclusion of nominees, for example, and successors. But let's start off with the basics. We know that from April, anyone who receives benefits from a plan where the member has died pre-75 will receive those benefits tax-free. So if that's a lump sum being paid outside of a pension, there's no 55% tax charge. If it's a pension's income, whether that's drawing money from an ongoing drawdown fund, for example, and the member dies before age 75, there's no marginal rate of income tax, assuming the claim, the first benefit payment, is made after April. And the same applies to annuities as well. Guaranteed period, spouse's pension, again, no marginal rate of income tax if those benefits are paid before age 75. After age 75, you've got your 45% for those lump sums outside of pensions. And of course, what they're looking at is marginal rates of income tax for future tax years. And then you've got marginal rates of the recipient on the drawdown or annuity income after 75 as well. So it's all good news. Any reduction in tax has got to be fantastic news for the consumer. I think we do have to take the pinch of salt which says, most people do actually die after 75. I did spot Tom Jones sort of prancing around on The Voice the other night. I think he's 74. So this assumption that 75 is actually really later life is probably a bit misplaced, with about 80% of individuals dying after that date. But anyway, it's still good news. It's a good benefit for individuals. But there have been some misunderstandings around this, and I just wanted to just briefly look at what happens with regards to these new classes of beneficiary. So let's remind ourselves, and let's use drawdown as an example, although this will also apply to annuity payments as well. We know that from an income point of view, as opposed to lump sums paying outside of annuity, from the payment of income on death, you always had the traditional dependent that income could be paid to, spouse, civil partner, child age under 23, unless they're, I've got a physical or mental impairment, and so on and so forth. The definition is on your screen, financial dependent. The new bit that comes in from April is we've got this new class of beneficiary called a nominee, whereby the member could nominate the death benefits as a pension's income to go to anybody, next door neighbour, whoever it might be. Probably more likely, an adult child, a member of the family that wouldn't ordinarily fall under the class of dependent. So maybe they're over 23, fit and healthy, or whatever. That can now be a nominee. And then that nominee or dependent then has another option themselves, particularly if there's a fund left, i.e. in the case of drawdown, they could then say, well, I've got this drawdown fund that I'm drawing from now, and I'll nominate somebody else to pass that pension's income to when I pass away. So again, you might have somebody who's the original member is cohabiting but not married or civil partnership. They nominate that individual, and that individual could nominate an adult child, for example, or you simply pass the money down and down the generations, whatever it might be. And of course, as each person passes away, if they pass away before age 75, there's no marginal rate of income tax payable. So that's basically the big news in terms of the new flexibilities on pensions income. But there has been some concern around whether the fact that a trustee has to accept this new class of nominee, whether that means that the IHT efficiency of a pension has now been called into question. And the answer is no, and I'll explain why that is. There have been conflicting views around this. There certainly was when it was initially announced. Let's say you've got a pension fund and the member passes away. The trustees have discretion over how they pay out those pension benefits to the remaining fund. Now, as far as financial dependents go, they've always had the option of saying, right, we could pay the benefits out as a lump sum outside the pension completely. In other words, you remove it from the pension. Traditionally, you've had the 55% tax charge. That's going away, but that was an option previously anyway. Or financial dependents could receive a pensions income. Fine. That's, with regards to, we've just talked through the changes of taxation on those two, but those two still exist. From a non-financial dependent perspective, the lump sum could probably be paid to a non-financial dependent, because on a lump sum taking it outside of a pension completely, the class of beneficiaries is normally fairly wide, which would include people other than financial dependents. The big thing that's happened is when it comes to pensions income, and the new option is just that one there, the fact that pensions income can be paid to a non-financial dependent, and that's the change. So the question mark around that is, do trustees still have discretion around this nominee? Well, let's just look at that in a bit more detail. Lump sum or pensions income can now be paid to a non-financial dependent. A lump sum situation was pretty much, generally the case anyway, or you could pay it to a trust or whatever it might be. On the pensions income side, and this may sound fairly obvious, the point about the nominee is that whilst that pension income can be paid to a non-dependent or a non-financial dependent, the trustees cannot just decide to pay it to the next door neighbour or adult child or whoever it might be unless the nomination has actually been made. So I know that sounds fairly obvious, but the point is the trustees can't make that decision by themselves if there is no nominee. However, even if there is somebody nominated who's a non-financial dependent and there are still other financial dependents around, the trustees still have discretion over whether they pay the nominee who's a non-financial dependent or indeed pay another financial dependent. And in any case, they still have discretion over whether they pay a lump sum or pensions income anyway. And in the case of a lump sum, obviously they've got more flexibility, or they've already had more flexibility there in any case. So the discretion is still there, but it's just adding this new class of nominee, which the trustees may wish to take into account, and obviously, 99% of the time probably will do. So hopefully, that's cleared up the issue around discretion. That potentially calls into question whether a bypass trust is still relevant, or whether this passing money down the generations means that bypass trusts are no longer needed. So again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but it just depends. It depends in terms of who wants to control the future beneficiaries, or who those future beneficiaries are. But if you have got cases where there's bypass trusts involved, it might just be worth a look to see whether that's still the most relevant scenario. Now, you'll know more about this than I, because we just do annuities, or in the main, as you know. But as I understand it, in the old world, if you like, if you wanted to pass money down the generations, you would have had to take that outside of the pension arrangement, because the income could have only been paid to that sort of restricted class of beneficiaries previously. So in the old days, you would have had a pension, crystallised or uncrystallised, which would go outside of the pension to a spouse. Obviously, a tax charge would potentially apply. In the old world, 55%, and obviously we know that's changing. That would have come out of the pension arrangement to the spouse, traditionally or sort of typically. That takes it outside the pension, puts it into the spouse's estate, which means that on the death of a spouse, those benefits could be passed to the children, but obviously they're not in the pensions wrapper as they would be under the new rules. So that's why, isn't it, that people would use perhaps a bypass trust, and there might be 40% IHT to pay at that stage, depending on how much of the nil rate band had been used. So the bypass trust, of course, you would have said, right, instead of doing that, let's nominate it as a bypass trust instead. There might again be some tax in making that payment outside of a pensions wrapper into the trust, but the idea was, from an IHT perspective, the money's in a trust, but we could still make the spouse a beneficiary. So the trustee could decide to still allow the spouse an income, or indeed, make loans to the spouse, which might be a cleverer idea because obviously those loans would have to be repaid on death, reducing the estate and increasing the value of the bypass trust again. Hey presto, people left as beneficiaries of the children, no IHT to pay. So again, periodic exit charges, there may be more tax to pay, but those are the reasons for using a bypass trust. Now, given this new environment that we have, where the money could just be passed down in a pensions wrapper anyway, the question is, why not just pass that money down within a pension arrangement? There's no right or wrong answer to this, but whilst there might be different rates of tax payable in each of those stages, the question is who wants control of the future beneficiaries. So again, it's not a case of a right or wrong. There's the sort of things we've just been talking about. The key thing about this is bypass trust or not, who wants the control of the beneficiaries. With a bypass trust, the member establishes who the ultimate beneficiaries are. Passing the money down the pension fund, of course, it's the dependent or nominee who they themselves choose the successors, which may not necessarily be the individuals that the original member may have chosen. Particularly if you've got, I suppose, blended families, children from different marriages and so forth, it's around control. Some people may say, well, actually what I'll do is I'll review at age 75 of the member because of the change in taxation. So, again, just hopefully that brings together some of the points on the death benefit side of things. So what I wanted to do now is just have a little bit of a Friday morning case study to try and bring some aspects together. Again, we're doing a lot of coverage of the other aspects of freedom and choice, and again, we've been on the road, and I'm sure we'll have a presentation coming to you in terms of some of the other aspects of the Taxation of Pensions Act. But I just wanted to think about, really, we're going to have cases when we have cases on the 7th of April or thereafter, individuals presumably are going to not necessarily worry about the overriding rules, but actually how it impacts them personally. So what I've got here is a little case study. It's not necessarily saying this is the only answer to this case study. What we'll do is have a look at how we might address Bob and Pauline's situation here, but then consider whether there might have been other ways of doing it, because to sort of coin a very old phrase, that there are more than one ways to skin a cat. It depends on the personal circumstances of the individual, attitude to risk, and so forth. And given the new freedoms, there might be more than one way of doing different things. So this is a way. It's a suggestion just to think about, but hopefully it encapsulates one or two ideas that are going to be relevant from April. So we've got Bob and Pauline. Bob is 65, Pauline is 62, and pre-retirement they had an income of £52,000. They're entering retirement. They've already got some state pension and expecting some scheme pensions coming in as well of about £11,000 per annum. Clearly, not necessarily had the full state pension there, but nevertheless there will be circumstances where people haven't managed to achieve that, but we'll come on to that in a bit. So £11,000 per annum, and let's assume there's an escalation rate there, as there normally is, triple lock for the basic state pension, and there might be some escalation on the scheme pension as well, depending on how that looks. There's the pension funds available: £61,500 for Bob, which is in a section 32, and a couple of personal pension funds there. Unlike a lot of people, it seems they've done quite well, and they're way over and above the average pension pot there. So let's have a look at what they need. Well, their initial cash requirement, let's say, is £60,000. I mean, it's one of the things I think I suppose as an advantage of the pension freedoms is that where people have got specific needs at retirement, typically things like endowment shortfalls and so forth, access to a pension fund seems to be quite a good idea for some folk. Nevertheless, let's assume we can extinguish 60k as cash, or that's what they need. Their initial income requirement is £20,000 per annum. They recognise that that's a drop from where they were before, but taking a realistic view of things. But they also want £16,000 to be fixed. One of the things that Rory Percival was saying just before Christmas was that when it comes to things like capacity for loss, he was saying that capacity for loss is a hard-nosed sort of calculation. What can the client not do without? How much does it, I'm paraphrasing, how much does it cost to go to Tesco's, do the weekly shop, pay for the gas and electric, all the things that the client needs to have, which they can't afford to do without. What are the regular bills? And they've come to a figure of £16,000 in this case. However, they do want scope for flexible income for the future, because that's what freedom and choice is all about, and they're interested in some of the death benefit scenarios that we've just been talking through. So let's have a look at what they can achieve. Can they achieve that £60,000 tax-free cash, PCLS? Well, Section 32 had protected tax-free cash of £31,000. Old occupational rules, pre-2006, they got some protected cash in there. PP funds 25%, and so the total for cash is 64,750. So hey presto, they could get their tax-free cash out. Obviously, with freedom and choice, they could have some other, grab some other money from their pension fund as well, but obviously it wouldn't be tax-free. The question is, I suppose, can Bob actually get his hands on a protected tax-free cash from that Section 32? Because otherwise they're not going to get to their £60,000. And if he can, what flexibilities has he got left on the rest of the fund? Now, it's worth making mention, although it's a very limited window, and it's probably, let's be honest, too late unless it's already started the process on this. There is an easement in terms of buddy transfers. Clearly, if Bob can, find somebody else to transfer with from his scheme to another arrangement on the same day, then he can protect his tax-free cash. There is a buddy easement. It has been a buddy transfer easement, but it is very, very limited in terms of being able to use it. You've got to transfer the funds before the 6th of April and take the benefits before the 6th of October if Bob actually wants to see that protected tax-free cash, and he wouldn't need a buddy to do that. Buddy transfers as they are still exist, but non-buddy transfers are allowable for a very short window. The likelihood is that if we're looking at this now, he's probably going to miss the boat on transferring his 32 unless he can find a buddy. And again, it depends how the plan was written. Is it an individual arrangement, or is it sort of a wider master trust type scenario? So the likelihood is old Bob's going to have to stay with his Section 32 if he wants that protected tax-free cash. So there are three options that he could do with that protected cash. The first one is he could use UFPLS. Now, the thing to note on UFPLS when it comes to things like protected tax-free cash is you can't have it. If you've got an uncrystallised funds pension lump sum, the way that's structured is 25% is tax-free and the balance is taxed as income. So if you use UFPLS, and let's say that scheme offers UFPLS, it doesn't count for protected tax-free cash. So you would lose the tax-free cash if he decided to take that whole fund. Remember, they wanted £60,000. That would, well, on the face of it, if they didn't, they might think that would do it. Of course, anything over the 15,375 is going to be taxable on that, and of course, because it's not a small pot or triviality, it will be taxed at the highest marginal rate on the month one. So just be mindful of that. So he wouldn't be able to achieve that via UFPLS in terms of the tax-free cash. He could, as we mentioned, stay within the Section 32 and just take the protected cash from the 32, and of course then he could shop around for the annuity with the open market option. That would be an option for him. It will certainly give him protected cash. If he simply transfers it to FAD and he's going to miss out on that buddy easement, then obviously he's only going to get his 25%. So the answer is, in this particular scenario, actually, if they've said they want the level of guaranteed income anyway, and this would go towards a tax-free cash from a protected amount, well, why don't we start to use that fund and think about actually taking the protected cash and using that fund for part of the guaranteed element. That seems to be the easiest solution and certainly a reasonable way forward. So they can achieve their tax-free cash. That can be achieved if we take the cash directly from the 32. Now then, what have they got left? If they extinguish that 64,750, that achieves their 60,000 tax-free cash and a little bit more. What have they now got left in terms of pension funds? Well, the total comes to, if you look at the pension funds we started off with and taking off the tax-free cash which they've said they need, they've got £131,750 left. So this is a very specific case study, but again, just trying to throw some ideas, some scenarios together. You know, how do we actually look at these smart objectives around taking a pensions income? What does a sensible route look like for these individuals? They've said that they want a £20,000 income overall, £16,000 of which they've said wants to be guaranteed, but they want to have some flexibility of the other 4,000. And of course, they could increase or decrease that 4,000, you know, as time goes on. You know, it's 4,000 initially, let's say. Well, they've already got £11,000 coming in on a guaranteed basis. Remember the state and scheme pensions. So they've got that there, but they do still have a shortfall of £5,000 on the guaranteed side, £4,000 flexible, so £9,000 is a shortfall overall, £5,000 of which needs to be guaranteed. So the reason that we're looking at this is because they specifically said, you know, we want, and remember those examples earlier from Nest and some other surveys that have been in play, we want an element of our income absolutely guaranteed. So let's have a look at this this income need and how they might achieve it. First of all, let's deal with the guaranteed part. Bob has taken his protected tax-free cash of 31,000. He's now got 30,500 left in the fund. Because he's taken his cash from the 32, the likelihood is that he's going to have to use an annuity for that bit. The annuity would give him 2,324 on that fund, 30,500, but he's still got his remaining PP fund there as well. Let's say that Pauline also purchases an annuity with her remaining fund of 43,500. That has given 2,749, and obviously there wouldn't be a fund there any longer. However, let's not forget that with Bob still having 57,750 left, you know, and the death benefit scenario, the continuation of income if he should die first, and so forth, you know, there is flexibility for that income to continue even after Bob has passed away. So they can achieve this guaranteed income of just over £5,000 per annum, and they've got their tax-free cash requirement. The outstanding bit, of course, is that £4,000, but we've got a fund left of 57,750. So there are various ways we could do this. If we look at the scenario we put together there, and again, we're just saying this is an answer. I'm sure there'll be other ideas that could be used around this. We could say, well, look, let's put the incomes together. So there's Bob's income there from the remaining fund that he's used for an annuity for his Section 32. That's a guaranteed element that he's required. Put Pauline's annuity on top of that, and they guaranteed their 5,000, just over £5,000 per annum through an annuity route. You've got an underpin in place there. Whatever happens now to the drawdown fund, if they're using the rest of the fund for FAD, whatever happens to that, they know that they've got all of their fixed income requirements covered. The 11,000 plus the £5,000 guaranteed through an annuity, and that's all covered. Now, let's have a look at how long the rest of the fund would need to last. Average life expectancy for a male age 65 is about 86, 87 years of age. However, there is also another thing called a mode, which is different from a mean average. The mode, in terms of the most likely date of death for a 65-year-old, is age 89, and so we'll use the sort of oldest life on this one to extrapolate that. And what we find, and I promise you this wasn't on purpose, but what we find is that if we look at the Flexi Access Drawdown Fund and we look at the remaining £4,000, if we have a growth rate of 4% on that fund, funnily enough, the fund lasts with that income to that age of 89. So that may well work for those individuals. And of course, if Bob passes away before that, then obviously you've got that flexible situation of the income still coming in for Pauline and so forth, using her marginal rates of tax. So that income can still stay in place even if Bob passes away. And of course, Pauline passes away first, same situation, that's still that FAD income still in play. So that might work. However, the problem is there's still a risk there in terms of maintaining that income. This is very typical of, I'll just go back to this, this is very typical, isn't it, of a sort of cash flow modelling sort of situation. What's happening to the capital underneath that FAD? Well, what we've got here is just, as I say, drawing that FAD out. It's around about between 6 and 7% is what they're actually taking to get to that income level, but we've assumed a 4% net growth. So obviously you can see that that income is going to deplete over that period of time. So that's what's happening to the capital in the background with regard to that. Now, of course, actually, when you put that in with the existing benefits, the £11,000 that's already coming in, and bearing in mind that's going to escalate at 2.5%, maybe it's not such a pronounced drop, and maybe the solution actually works. It depends. It depends. You know, whether they can cope with that drop of income at that time. But of course, there are a number of other things they can do. So this is just having a look at, you know, what sorts of scenarios, what sort of information we can put together to try and find the best route for these individuals. Remember, they've said they want that specific guarantee from outset, so we've got to put that in place. But what else could we do with the FAD income? So there's a number of things they could have done. I've just put in one scenario there, but there's lots of other things they could have done, and that's, I suppose, one of the key issues in terms of why people need advice. That's an answer. Is it the answer? Might be, might not be. For example, they could have just reduced their FAD income overall. So what they could have said was, actually, we can afford to maybe only take 3,000. So what's the break-even point, making the assumptions of where the income actually stays in place? At 4% net growth, if they only assume a £3,000 per annum withdrawal on the FAD, then maybe that's a different scenario. It lasts way beyond age 100, assuming we get a nice steady growth. Obviously, this would all have to be reviewed on an annual basis to see exactly how that fund is doing. What it means is, on a £3,000 level, you're going to that fund's going to last way beyond 100 on the basis that we've established there. But all of this information, of course, could be put into a third-party cash flow modelling tool, of which there are a number around. The point is that obviously there needs to be a plan. We need to take into account longevity, and we need to understand the requirement for that underpin. What else could we have done? You know, there's a number of scenarios we could look at. What about reanalysing this need for a U-shaped retirement? Is the shape of the benefits the right one? You know, could they have actually taken a view that they actually want to decrease that income at some stage to make it last for longer? That sort of, you know, active, passive, and more dependent stages of retirement. Should that have been accounted for in a more sensible way? What about, and of course I would say this, purchasing a higher level of annuity, i.e., you know, using more of a fund towards the annuity, you know, making sure that that income isn't going to run out. Might be right. Might be wrong, depending on how much flexibility they want on the rest of the remaining fund. Remember that in this particular example, they still had an extra bit of tax-free cash. They wanted 60,000, they got 64,750. Well, actually, do we defer some of the income because we've got extra tax-free cash in that first year? That's another option for these individuals. Deferring the state pension. You know, if they're a situation where, you know, they can actually start to take some of that income a year later, maybe take some FAD in the initial period, but actually defer some of the state pension so that they get an increase on that. That increase changes to about half of that after 2016, but nevertheless, that might be an option for them to look at. What else could they do? Well, is it all about using the pension funds to take the benefit straight from the pension fund? Could they, for example, have extinguished part of the fund and made some Class 3A national insurance contributions, or even Class 3, you know, to make up any shortfall that they had in their state benefits. You'll remember that they weren't quite up to the highest level of state pension they could have had. Could they make some 3A contributions as well? That's sort of a new bit that's going to be available from October. So on the Class 3A, for example, they could say, well, I'm not going to get to the new level of flat rate pension, but what I can do is from October make some voluntary contributions to this new style of NI, or this new class of NI, which basically says if I'm over SPA before the 6th of April 2016, then I can buy some extra income from the state. So basically what it means is that for a 65-year-old, you're looking at buying an extra £1 a week for £890, up to a maximum of £25 a week. Now, bearing in mind that has escalation at CPI and a 50% spouse's pension, that's a pretty good deal. That's about 5.84% for a 65-year-old. There are circumstances where there are other age groups, so potentially from October, a 63-year-old female, for example, will have reached state pension age and can also make those contributions at an earlier age, and so on. But for a 65-year-old, you're looking at £1,300 per year for 22,250, which again, is about 5.84%. So again, there is other options that are available to individuals. It's not just about use of the pension fund directly. Remember, if they are going to extinguish some of the pension fund to do that, you've got to look at, you know, could they have actually bought that benefit from the gross pension fund as opposed to perhaps drawing it out and paying tax and using the Class 3. But again, these are all considerations that need to come into play. So it's just one or two ideas, and I say it's not necessarily the answer, it's an answer, but you know, just some of the considerations that people will need to make. How do we reduce the cost of the underpin bit? So I suppose that's our bit really in terms of an annuity provider. As we've said, it's not all about annuities, and you'll be hearing about some innovations over the next few weeks around new products and so forth. But you know, our sort of intellectual property, our knowledge and expertise is still going to be around providing guarantees for those people you know, that have got reduced life expectancy and so forth, really taking into account very specific medical underwriting details and so forth. But you'll be pleased to hear that there is some new flexibility coming in, which we will be announcing to you very shortly. How do we reduce that cost of the underpin? Well, one of the things that the Treasury have said, and again has been reiterated through those FCA papers, again they came out in December, and they talked about people's perceptions of annuities, but both the Treasury and the FCA have made it very, very clear that an annuity isn't an investment. A FAD is an investment, that's where you get your invested income from. An annuity is the insurance bit. They've been very, very clear on that. And so if we are treating an annuity as an insurance, then my view is that, like any other insurance, why don't we pay as little as possible for the underpin bit? You know, actually reduce the premium, reduce the cost of buying a set level of income, and therefore we've got more for freedom and choice that we've been talking about. So, you may have seen this before, but as far as we're concerned, the whole direction of travel is looking at target benefits to make sure that you're paying for that annuity in an efficient manner to release more for freedom and choice. So this tool here, the target income calculator, basically asks the question, what are those fixed costs? Remember Bob and Pauline there? What fixed costs did they actually have? You know, what are those ongoing regular costs? And therefore, how much income is already guaranteed? In their case, you know, they wanted £16,000 guaranteed, but if you've got a client who's got a similar scenario and they've got £16,000 coming in through other pension arrangements, scheme, you know, the happy days, freedom and choice. You know, you've got more flexibility to use those funds in a more flexible manner. But if you haven't got all of your income guaranteed, what is the shortfall? And frankly, how do we pay as little for that shortfall as possible? So using the best rates to use the smallest fund for a set level of income. if we use personal details, start to blend in some of the ideas around, health and lifestyle, then again, clearly we can reduce that premium, if you like, for this insurance called an annuity even further. What fund is available? Press the button, and it will basically give you a breakdown of where the various elements might come from and how much those individuals have got left for freedom and choice. So that's a tool that's available. We have also got PDFs as well. So actually, if you wanted to, get those filled out before going on to that target income calculator, sitting down with the client, or even if you want to work out what the cost of a guarantee might be, as almost a ready reckoner, so that you can plumb that into a cash flow modelling tool and look at some of these scenarios, then you could use that calculator, get a rate, and start to compare, spending some of the fund on a guarantee or actually drawing an income from it. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but it's all good information that can be plumbed into the cash flow modelling tool. What you'd also want to do is, once you've got that quote off the system, is maybe to then go further and actually go for full medical underwriting. But it will give you an idea of the sort of cost involved. Full medical underwriting, of course, will give you an even more sort of tailored rate. But this tool is a good starting point to give you a really good idea in terms of how much a guarantee might cost for an individual. So hopefully that's a way that we can help you. That kind of comes to the end of the session. There's the learning objectives, which I hope we've met, or certainly if we haven't, then there's certainly some ideas that you can look into. Again, we're only a week or so away from all of this stuff, so I thought it would be helpful just to look at the sort of things that you might be looking at post 6th or 7th of April, isn't it? Because I think we're on bank holiday on the 6th. So hopefully that's been a useful, sort of a more practical session for you, and I hope to see you at an event in the very near future. Thank you very much. I will pass back to the team at NMBA.
Martin, thank you very much indeed for that. Right, we can now move on to addressing your questions. And first of all, thank you very much for Xander for the reminder. We will be sending you out copies of the slides and also CPD certificates for this session. But so far, we haven't got any questions through, so we can hang around for a minute or two and see if any come to light. Yeah, first question then. Thank you, Daniel. How do I access the calculator tool, Martin?
Okay, it's actually available directly from our website under Tools and Calculators. So it's partnership.co.uk. If you go on to, there's a tab that's called Tools and Calculators, and it's right under there. So you don't need a password or anything like that to go into there. And our account managers will obviously be happy to talk you through exactly how that works, but I think you find it's pretty straightforward. But it's under Tools and Calculators on the website there.
Thank you. Question from Michael: how do I invest to provide the guarantees, or how do you invest to provide the guarantees?
Well, again, I suppose from a guaranteed perspective, I think it's important to note what the Treasury and the FCA are saying in terms of it being an insurance rather than an investment. But clearly, there is an element of various elements in terms of how that guarantee is backed. Although I suppose the risk is on us rather than the individual. So from that perspective, that's a risk taken on by ourselves. But you'll find that there will be, an element of gilts in there, and other kind of fixed income producing assets. So there will be, investment grade bonds and so forth within the mix. What I can do is, if you send me on the individual's details, I have got a very good article that was put together by our Chief Investment Officer, which give you a little bit more details. It's quite detailed in terms of how that works. But of course, the thing with an annuity company is you really have less flexibility in the types of assets you can invest in. Obviously, the client doesn't see any of that anyway. As I say, the risk is borne by ourselves, but it does mean that you have to buy assets that have to produce a fixed income to a very, very large degree because of taking on that risk. And of course, we've got Solvency II around the corner, and it looks very much like they will take an individual perspective on different firms in terms of the guidance around investment under Solvency II. But at the moment, there's a mix of different assets, but largely, there's an element of gilts, but also, other income-producing assets such as corporate bonds and so forth. And that's essentially how it's achieved. But send me on the details, and I'll send over that article because it's quite detailed in terms of the investment philosophy from our end.
Yeah, we will do. We've got Michael's details.
Great, thank you.
Another one from Michael. How will that cope with rising interest rates?
You've got a situation where I think we've all seen, some of the costs involved in, putting an escalation on an annuity, and again, because of the sorts of things you can invest in as an annuity company, it is much more difficult to secure, that rising income, and I think we all know the costs involved in terms of setting out that income escalation at outset. And there is an argument that says, well, rather than taking an escalating amount, is it better in some circumstances to look at not necessarily waiting for that breaking point, which typically, I suppose, on a 3% escalation, can often be 12 years or so, and then another 12 years to make up the balance the other side. So whilst people want escalation from things like an annuities, the reality is, when you look at the figures, a lot of people think, well, actually, that's not necessarily the way forward. I think with the freedom and flexibility, and again, I'm trying to sort of not wear too much of an annuity hat on this, because the reality is that people can obviously take flexible income from elsewhere. So you might say, well, I want a level of underpin. You might even phase in different guarantees as you go along the journey, rather than necessarily buying, an escalation up front. There is product innovation coming, which unfortunately, for the remit of today, we're yet to make the sort of final announcements on there, but you will find that there will be product innovation to deal with some of these issues. Yeah, I mean, on our case study there, as an example, what we had with Bob and Pauline was a very large amount, well, I say very large, but very large amount relative, I suppose, to the overall income, which was already escalating. So escalating benefits from state pensions, scheme pensions, and so forth. And I suppose you've got to look at the overall picture around how their whole income is escalating, not just necessarily the annuity bit, and therefore what difference it makes to the overall picture. But I take the point. I think the point that Michael's probably getting at is the cost of escalation on an annuity, those are considerations which I suppose now, given the freedom and choice, that escalation can be taken from other benefits, not least of all FAD, of course, or phasing in different guarantees at different times if that level of guarantee needs to increase. You've now got the freedom and choice to do that, I suppose.
Thanks, Martin. Just last question that's coming now. If under the new pensions landscape an individual buys an annuity, will they have the option, say 5 years' time, to sell the annuity for a lump sum?
That is, well, the first meeting about that in regards to any form of consultation took place only last week. The reality is there is a lot of talk about the second-hand annuity market. The reality is there's still more questions than answers, so it's quite a difficult one to answer. Osborne is obviously committed to pushing that forward as a consultation, so there is definitely a mind from the government to say that people should be able to cash in their annuities. I'm not trying to duck the question, but there really are no real concrete answers to that. I mean, one of the things that seems to have come out is there are a couple of ways of doing it. You know, a sort of a commuted value, whereby, you know, will it be a case of the insurer who's paying the annuity out working out an actuarially, you know, an actuarial equivalent value or something like that, and just winding it up on a commuted basis? Is that how it's going to work? Is it going to be a case of, effectively, seems more likely, sort of a bidding situation where, you know, another provider could take on that annuity for a given lump sum to the individual, and so on and so forth? One of the key areas that they seem to be focusing on is how do you keep track of when that annuity needs to stop? Because one of the challenges with this is, if you've got an annuitant who wishes to sell their annuity, that family presumably has no real interest in letting the provider know when the member's passed away. With second-hand endowments, there was an end date on them. With second-hand annuities, there isn't, or there is, but you know, that's going to be variable. So all of those things, there was talk about, should there be a national register of deaths, for example, so that, you know, the annuity income would stop on certain days, you know, at certain times and so forth, and that was seen to be, you know, out of proportion. So there are a huge number of questions around how that would actually work, but yeah, the government does seem to have a mind to allow that. But the consultation has literally only just started and will be going on for you know, for some time to come, over the next, probably over the next year. But there is a mind to do that. Now, broadly speaking, you'll have seen the announcement from, or the statement from Steve Grove saying that, you know, we think that's, you know, we're generally in support of a second-hand annuity market. You know, if it gives more flexibility to individuals, then that's probably, you know, that's got to be a good thing.
Okay, I think we're done for questions, really, so I think it's probably about time to draw the session to a close. Martin, thank you again for an excellent session, and thank you to you all for attending. We've had a great turnout, so we're very, very pleased. As a reminder, we will send you copies of the slides by Monday. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend, and hope you look forward to future NMBA events and webinars. Thank you. Goodbye.